So I work in the School of Education. I work with teachers, training teachers, and I've been myself was a teacher, a principal, consultant, and now working at Pacific Oaks. So and also have 3 kids, so I raised some kids, and I have a granddaughter who's 5 years old who lives with us. So we're getting to see that in a whole different light. So I always think it's funny that, when my kids grew up, it was, what was that, Disney Afternoon with, I don't know if anyone remembers, Darkwing Duck and the Rescue Rangers, and now my granddaughter gets Bluey and Mira and whole different cartoons for them to see. It seems like, how many of you are educators? Great, great, we're all educated. So that's good. So we're kind of geared towards you guys trying to help out, and I know we have parents on and kind of try to help out both groups. All right. We're not a big group, so if you want to ask questions or make comments as I'm going along, feel free to do that. All right. Don't feel like you just have to sit there and listen to me and just wait till the end. Let's do that. I mean, we don't have a lot of time because this is really quick. We're really going to kind of touch on this. And as always, as you guys know, there's a lot. So I want to be able to kind of answer your questions as we go along and try to help you. Is this okay? Level of voice, we need to be louder. We're okay? All right. Trying to use my teacher voice. So we're going to talk about anti-bias. It's a weird thing, really, because we're anti-bias. Bias itself is not a bad thing, right? We tend to use this. I think when we talk about anti-bias, and we're going to talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly. And really, when we talk about anti-bias, we're really talking about the bad and the ugly, right? Bias is really a natural part of the way your brain works. One of the things that you need to be aware of is your brain tries to be efficient, right? Your brain is very efficient. You know what was interesting? I learned that you don't actually see everything that you're seeing. Your brain puts things there for you. Meaning, like when you're driving, like the brain does not have time to see everything. So what it does, it says, oh, that's a building. Here's probably what the building should look like. So it's creating these images for you because it's trying to be efficient. Instead of taking the time to process everything, it tries to be efficient. And that's where biases really come in. It's from the brain being efficient, right? It has to make decisions. It has to make decisions. Is this good or is this bad, right? Should I eat that? Should I not eat that, right? If you think about early humans, right, when they're going out there, I always think, have you guys ever thought about, like, who was the first person to, like, eat a potato? Like, who dug something up from the ground and said, oh, this looks like a rock. Why don't we eat it? Right? Who can? Someone had to make a decision on, is this good or is this not good? And it's the same thing. So if you see an animal, again, think about early humans, see an animal, it's like, is this a friendly animal or is it animal is a danger to me? And that's really where our biases come from. It's our brain trying to be efficient and making snap decisions. Now, maybe for early humans, it was useful for survival. The problem with now is that it creates some problems, all right? And the problems that it creates is we get too much. We're not always judging things and meaning, is that good or not? But we're being judgmental of things and making decisions like that's not good. That is bad. And we're not taking the time to be judicious, meaning, let me kind of think this through. We're not in that position where we have to always be worried about survival. I'm not saying that never happens, but we don't have to worry about that the same way early humans did. And so we could take more time to decide, is this good or is this not good? We don't have to make snap decisions, but our brain still wants to make snap decisions, right? And so that's one of the problems. So the brain likes to look at the world and see. But there are good things about being biased, right? Because your brain is biased, your brain is able to kind of be part of a family, part of a culture, right? This is my family. This is good. I want to be a part of this, right? So you guys that are educators working at schools, you made a decision to be there. And it probably was some of that bias where you said, this is a good place for me to be, right? This is a good place for me to work. I want to do this. Uh, when I first started in education, I actually, ironically, I wanted to be a business major. And then I got a part-time job teaching PE. And I said, I like this, right? I like working with students, right? I like this. And I started to have a bias toward that. And so I changed my career path from being in business to being in education. And we have biases, right? When people feel like they belong, yes.
I just had a question about what age were the kids that you worked with?
At PE,
Yeah,
I was at a school that was a private school, so it was kindergarten to eighth grade. So I did all.
okay.
So yeah, kindergartners are fun. When I was a principal, I was at a school that was also, and kindergartners are really good about giving you hugs and helping you out. You know, if I always say, if you want to feel like a celebrity, go work with little kids, right? You can feel like a celebrity. Uh, so really, a good bias helps us to understand how we fit in, right? A good bias helps us to understand who are our people, right? And how do we fit into that group? A good bias helps us to understand who we are and gives us that feelings of we belong, right? That's what good bias does for us. So we're not throwing away bias. We're not saying that's why we use the term anti-bias. We're really talking about the bad and the ugly, but biases do help us out because again, we feel like we belong. And it's really what we want to keep. We want to keep this feeling of, yeah, I feel good at where I'm at and I belong. Um, it's interesting that one of the things now that we're kind of taking a look at um, that we really didn't look at before is the idea about belonging and how much when people feel like they belong, they thrive and they strive. And you probably see that from the students that you guys work with, right? The kids that you work with. And really, when we talk about some of the problems that kids have, especially at schools, if you really were to think about it, some of those really come when they feel like they don't belong, right? Either they don't feel like they belong because of the work they're doing or not being able to do, or they feel like they don't belong because of the friends that they have, right? They lose that sense. So biases are good to help us feel where we belong and how we belong. Now, really, unfortunately, there are some bad things about biases, right? And you guys are probably aware of this, and you guys have probably given me some. Well, let me ask you guys, where do you think are some bad things about bias? Let me give you one before you start to go, because you're going to go into the ugly, because people go into the ugly. But one of the things and not that I didn't notice this before, but now that I have a granddaughter who's 5, kind of re-looking at this, right? And I was at Target and I wanted to buy my granddaughter when she was like about 3. And I remember my daughter saying, "Oh, she doesn't have any shorts and stuff like that. And I'm gonna have to go buy her shorts." I was at Target. Oh, I'm gonna buy her some shorts, right? So I go to buy her shorts, and of course I go to which section? I go to the girls section, right? I'm picking up the girls' shorts, and they are short shorts. They're like about for a 3-year-old. They are short shorts and very frilly and very tight. And of course, you guys know this, no pockets, right? And I go to the boys section, and the shorts are longer, right? Have pockets and are not as tight fitting. So I bought her some boys shorts. Um, and I looked at the girls section and looking at girls' clothes compared to boys' clothes. And even t-shirts, girls' clothes, a lot tighter fitting. And this is for little kids, right? Than boys are. Boys had all these cool types of t-shirts. Girls had very limited. They were very like the very sparkly, maybe unicorns, had phrases on like like I'm cute, something like that. You know what I'm saying? They weren't just regular graphic tees. So, so what that does, obviously, it starts to pigeonhole, right? It starts to say, here's what it means to be something. Here's what that means. What are some examples that you guys see of bad bias? Yeah,
Kind of along the similar line as the idea of what type of play is okay for genders. And parents getting really upset about a child being in a dress if they're a boy or playing with babies. And having to explain that, that's not a gendered thing, and they are curious about representing what they're seeing in their life, that seeing babies isn't gender thing. You don't need to tell boys they can't, or that girls can't play with construction.
exactly right. How genders play, right, is a big thing. You know what's really interesting? They did a study, and this was back in, I want to say, like late '90s, early 2000s, looking at the question that they had, the research question was, why are boys better at science than girls are, right? Why are boys better at science? Why do you think boys are better at science than girls are? When we talk about this, especially at that time, why was it looking at boys were going into science more, boys were excelling at science more at all levels than girls were. Girls were struggling with that, right? And what do you think, what subject do you think girls were better at?
English.
English. You're right. English. They were better at English. They're better at reading and writing. So the question is, why is that? Why is it that boys are excelling at science and girls are excelling at ELA type of things? And so what they found was a lot of it had to do with play. Because boys, here's how boys were playing, right? Boys were building things, right? Boys were, come on in, have a seat up here. Boys were building things. Boys were creating bridges to go over things. Boys were trying things out. They were doing, right, what is common with what we would consider scientific method, right? Meaning trial and error. They were trying things out. They were in a lot of experimentation. Well, what kind of play did they see with girls, do you think? They were playing with dolls, right? They were playing house. They were playing stories. They were into, so to them, there were stories that were involved in their play, right? This person was doing this, and then this person did that. And so there was the beginning, the middle, the conclusion, right? That's how they played. So of course that translated into school. When we start looking at that, boys get into science and they're naturally doing better, not because of any genetic type of thing, but because of the type of play that they do. And girls were doing better in ELA because of the type of play that they were doing. So, but we have a bias on, again, if you want to know about how we have biases for boys and girls, all you have to do is go to a department store and go look at the toy section, right? And see what toys are for boys, what toys are for girls. And you'll see, this is our bias. These are cultural biases. And because of that, this is what happens, right? We start limiting kids' beliefs on who they can be. So, and I think it's interesting, and again, with my own kids and with my granddaughter, I try to counter some of this. It's really difficult, right? It's really difficult. Try to counter some of that. But even my granddaughter at 5 will say, oh no, those are boys' toys, right? Those aren't girl toys. And I think, it's okay. You can play with that if you want to. It doesn't have to be for boys. It doesn't have to be for girls. But that's already the message that she's getting. And so this is one of the problems with biases, is that we start to deliver these messages to people, right? We start to say, here's who you are, or here's who you can be. So all of a sudden you have kids start to think internally, what this means, right? Here's who I am, or here's all I can be. I could never be this because this is who I am. And the other part is this happens for us as adults, right? Is we have biases towards certain people, right? And so that certain person might end up being, I don't want to use the term favorite, but might be our preferred, right? And so we spend more time with them. It happens with parents, right? Do parents have a preference on children if they have multiple children? Do they?
Right.
Don't say that.
I won't say that parents love a child more than another. But yes, preferences. Why do they have preferences? It's a natural bias, right? Who are you going to have preference to?
Someone who's similar and he's.
Someone similar to you. I mean, that's a natural thing. This is the way the brain works. Remember, we talked about the brain is trying to figure out the world, and the brain is trying to figure out what is good for me, right? What is safe for me? Where do I belong? Oh, you're like me. I belong here, right? So we have this affinity. We'll talk about it a little bit later. There's affinity towards people who are like us. That's a natural, right? That's just the way the brain works. So do parents have preferences? Yes. Right? We all have preferences. It doesn't mean they don't love their kids. I'm not saying that. I don't want to try to imply that's true, that some parents love kids other than, and I would say I have 3 kids. I have two boys and a daughter. And my son, my oldest son, is when he was in school, was very popular. He was very good at a lot of stuff he did. Academically, he was okay. But the social part, he can get along with a lot of people, right? Even now, he's the kind of guy that can go in a place and interact with people, and people feel good about being around him, right? That was not me. Let me just put it that way. I was not that person in school, right? My youngest son, Anthony, is a person who in school, because he had ADD, of course still does, I mean, no one ever grows out of that, he had a hard time making friends, right? So he was a little bit more reserved in that. And not that I was at the same set that he was, but I was more like Anthony, right? So for me, I can relate to Anthony more than I can relate to David's experience. That wasn't my experience, right? It has nothing to do with how much I love my kids, how much I care for them, and how much I would do for them. But it just means I understand Anthony a lot more than I understand David's experience. So, of course, that makes a difference. So, but that's what happened. But we have to be conscious of that, because if we're not, then it does become a, right? So it does become, we have to be aware that we can have preferences. And so what we have to do is think about, okay, how am I treating people? And this can happen for you guys, right? You have a group of students, right? Do you have preferences?
Yeah.
Yes. Why do you have preferences? Again, it's your bias, right? Because for some reason that particular kid connects with you, right? So that's a natural thing. We don't beat ourselves up for having preferences, but what we don't want to do is make those preferences start to hurt other kids, right? We have to be thinking about it, right? We have to be thinking about, okay, if I'm doing for this one, I do for all, because that's the way that keeps me from starting to single that kid out as being the favorite. And that's why in schools, oh, teacher's pet, right? Because what happened is that teacher has a preference, and let that preference become a problem in the classroom. Because what happened was they started to say, no, this is the one I have a preference to. I don't have a preference to you, so you don't get what this person gets. And that's where it became a problem, right? So all we got to do is that. And so I used to joke around with, when I was a principal, I used to joke around even with teachers or kids, and they'd say, at that time, Mr. Cortez, Mr. Cortez, can you do whatever for me? And I'd say, for you, yes, I'll do it. And I'd say, if it was anybody else, I'd probably do it too. More to remind myself, right? And I'm not You know, if it's something that's good, then I'll do it forever. If it's something that's not good, I won't do it for everybody. It doesn't matter. So, but that's really the biggest concern is this whole idea about limiting beliefs. And so that what happens is students stop to see what they can become and only see what they are now. Right? And that's a big thing. Students stop seeing what they can become and only see what they are. And for some people, what they see, who they are, is not great. This is really the biggest problem when we talk about bias, right? We talk about the ugly, right? And the ugly is when we start talking about discrimination, when we start talking about prejudice, right? When we start talking about being judgmental, when we start, the opposite of belonging is othering, right? When we say, not only do you not belong, but you don't belong anywhere, right? You don't belong here, you don't belong anywhere. This is something that you probably see in schools, you know, we can see this, where students start to push other kids out, right? And so this is the thing they start making judgments about. And usually when this happens, why does this happen? When we get to the ugly part of bias, why does this happen? What are we making decisions based on usually? What's that? Appearance, yeah. Appearance or stereotypes, right? And so we have, and here's the other thing about with stereotypes in particular. Where do we get stereotypes from? We get stereotypes from people, from either our own experience, but mostly it's from other people's experience. And what I mean by our own experience is like, well, that one time I was with that one person, they were very rude to me. So therefore, everybody who is like that is rude, right? Or we get it from other people giving us their experience, which is like, hey, you know what? That group is like this and they're not very good. So we have to somehow treat them differently. And so that's what we end up doing, right? We ended up treating people differently. And appearance is a big thing. And I do want to point this out. Like, you know, when kids are bullied, and kids are bullied at all ages, and I'm sure you guys, even in early childhood, see kids that are bullied, or kids who talk about being bullied. Now, I'm always kind of a little bit, when I talk about bullying, because if you look at the definition of bullying, it's very specific, right? It's continuous, ongoing, right, and targeted. That's the definition about bullying. And so I talk about bully behavior because there's some behavior that is could become bullying, but maybe not exactly be there yet. But usually what that is geared towards is someone being different, right? Someone being different and attacking their appearance or attacking how they're different. And so what happens is the worst part about bullying is, I'm not just saying this isn't bad. The worst part about bullying is not so much the victim, but what happens with other people. And the worst part about bullying, again, it's the victim, which is bad. But if I target a person, right, because they're different, what happens to the rest of you, right? You don't want to be different. And so we see this especially and although it's interesting because it could happen even with little kids, but we see this especially when we start talking about kids when you get into intermediate grades, so we're talking about third grade and up. If I'm a person who's doing bully behavior and I start making fun of the shoes that you're wearing, guess the rest of the group never wear that type of shoe, right? Even if they had 10 pairs of it, they'll stop wearing it. And they'll start wearing the shoe that is appropriate. And so this is the reason why when we start talking about discrimination and prejudice, right? This is why it happens, is because people start to take on what someone else says is that. And so we start to work from that sense. So this is the ugly part, right? And so really, when we start trying to understand bias, there's these two things. There's the explicit bias and implicit bias. And explicit bias is what we know, right? If I were to ask you what's your favorite ice cream, you can tell me, right? What's your favorite ice cream? Mint chocolate chip. Okay. That's an explicit bias. You know what it is, right? If you go into a place where there's all these ice creams, you're going to pick that one out. That's a bias that you have. That's an explicit bias, right? We all have those explicit bias. And then we have implicit biases. Those are the ones we're not really aware of. We don't know that we have these biases, but they pop up, right? You can start to, it's hard to recognize your own implicit biases, but you can kind of start to recognize them. You start thinking about your behavior. And I always use this as an example. When I for the longest time growing up, I used to say that my favorite color was blue, right? When people were to ask me, what's your favorite color? I'd say blue, right? And then I started to recognize that actually, I recognize as an adult, the first car that I bought, first brand new car that I bought, not used car, first brand new car I bought was a red car. Really was like, wow, this is a great car. I bought a red car. After that, I bought another car. Guess what color it was? Red. It was red. I went to buy a third car. I had to stop myself from buying a red car. My wife said, "You're not going to buy another red car, are you?" I said, "Yeah, I'm kind of thinking about it, you know." But I kind of stopped myself and I bought a black car. But I started to recognize that I was attracted to red, right? I didn't even think about it. I didn't think that there was all these things that would attract me to that until I started to realize I have an implicit bias towards red, right? I didn't realize it. I thought it was blue. Really, it was red. And so you start to recognize the way. And when it comes to, especially if you want to think about it. And at the end, I have a link that you guys can go to that you can do an implicit bias test, right? And you can kind of check your own bias. And it really is bias of people, right? And they'll give you categories of different people, and you can do the test and see where your implicit bias is there or whether or not you have one. We have to start thinking about, like, how does that make us feel, right? How are you feeling about something, right? And so you start to recognize that, hey, maybe I have a bias there that I didn't recognize. So an affinity bias, and we already talked about that a little bit, is, you're going to have a bias towards things that are like you, right? Or things that you like. It could be, a sports team, right? I have a Dodgers jacket. If I were to come in here with a Dodgers jacket, somebody would go, right, yeah, Dodgers jacket. Somebody would be like, I can't believe that guy's here with a Dodger jacket, right? And I had to go do some consulting work in San Francisco a couple of weeks ago, right? And I told my wife, I said, I'm not taking a Dodger jacket. I don't want to be in San Francisco with a Dodger jacket. I don't think people will be very happy about it. And what happens is they look at me in a different way, right? Because it's got the Dodger fan, right? You can have an affinity towards people who like what you like, right? You can have an affinity of people who are like you. This is the reason why I was talking to Lauren about this before, is why we always have to be careful about hiring practices. Because we have, again, bias is the natural part of who we are. We can't stop ourselves from being biased. So if someone comes in, if I'm here to interview and I interview, let's say 5 people, right? And so what happens is, if I don't recognize my own bias, I'm going to choose the person who's like me. And I'm not going to do that. I might not even do it consciously. I'm just going to be like, something about that person that I just like. I just think they're the right person for the job. Well, yeah, of course, because if I really were to look at it, right, they probably are similar to me, right? They probably have same likes that I do, maybe same affiliation that I have. There's something, yes, of course, there's something I like about them, right? So I could be right away. Like, I got my doctorate at USC. So I could be someone say, like USC, oh, really? I like you automatically, right? Because we went to the same school. So that happens. That's why with hiring practice, we always have to think about, like, okay, wait a minute. Why am I attracted towards this particular candidate and not these? And it's one of the reasons why they always suggest that we have a hiring committee, right? So people can kind of counter that and say, okay, yeah, you like that person, but what about this person? What about that person? It's like, right now there's this whole thing about, DEI hires, right? Which is kind of interesting to me because our culture, our US culture, has always been this thing about like, hey, just give me the chance, right? We've all seen movies about like that sports, sport movies where that guy goes, give me a chance, coach. I'm going to show you I can do it, right? Give me a chance. Or whatever it is, like just give me the chance and I can show you that I can do it. We're built on that. Like, give me a chance and I can show you. That when we talk about DEI, or we talk about that, or we talk about hiring practices, all we're doing is saying, give this person a chance, right? So they can show us what they can do. That's all we're doing, right? Is give this person a chance. We have to cut, right? We have to cut through that affinity bias and say, we're not going to hire a person just because, but there's a reason for it, right? And then the other one that is dangerous, not only affinity bias, but conformity bias. Conformity bias says, I'm going to be drawn to things that conform what I already believe, right? I'm going to be drawn to things that already conform to what I believe. What's dangerous about this one is now we have algorithms who give you that conformity bias. If you didn't have it, they're going to give it to you. People don't recognize, like in social media, well, you probably know this already. If you start to watch a certain type of thing on social media, guess what it will feed you, right? More of that thing. That's what it is, a conformity bias. We would do that naturally. We gravitate towards things that are already validating what we already believe, right? Oh, I believe this person's a bad person, right? And then you read a story. Yep, see, I knew they were a bad person because, right? Or someone will tell you about that. Yep, I know. And then when someone says something counter to that, what do? Shut them out, right? Because like, no, that doesn't conform with what I believe, so I'm going to shut that out. So that one is the difference. And then association bias, similar to affinity, association bias is we will associate with the people that we have a bias towards, right? We associate with those people who are like us. So our friends are like us. It makes sense, right? It makes sense. Your friends are going to be people who like the things that you like and like to go places. That makes sense, right? The problem with it is when we start to exclude people because they don't fit into what we think. And so we have a problem.
Are they just using unconscious bias as a replacement word?
You can just go a little bit louder. It's my own ear.
Are people just interchanging now unconscious bias with implicit bias? Is it some other?
Can people?
I hear people using more unconscious bias.
Yes, people use more implicit bias than explicit bias. And that's the reason why it happens, right? The reason why it happens is because you don't recognize it. You would never say like, oh, I don't treat that person that have bias against them. I treat that person because, and then you give another reason, which it goes along with affinity bias or conformity bias.
Mostly has been using implicit beginning, and now they're using the term unconscious bias as opposed to.
Oh yeah, unconscious and implicit are the same thing. They're the same thing. Yeah, I'm saying they're the exact same thing. Yeah. So we're not aware of it. It's not something that we are aware of. It's just something we have. You always have bias. You can't not get away from it. You can never get to the point where you say, I have no bias. You will always have biases because again, it's the way the brain works, right? The brain is naturally going to say, this is good, this is not good. And so how does it make that decision? It tries to be efficient and says, things that are like me are good. Again, going back to that good, which says you belong to this tribe, right? So you want to keep belonging to this tribe. Unfortunately, right, you're starting to exclude a lot of people outside of that. So yes, it's unconscious bias, and we work mostly out of unconscious bias that we don't realize that we do. So, so again, any questions about this? We're going to start talking about what we can do about it. All right. Here's the problem, right? Whatever we perceive is what we believe. And then whatever we believe, we act on. So whatever we perceive, how we perceive people is how we're going to act, right? So again, if we perceive something as being bad, then it is bad, and we're going to treat it that way. If we perceive something as being good, and we're going to believe it's good, and we're going to act that way about it, right? Unless we do something different to try to change that, right? And really, we start talking about a fixed mindset versus a growth mindset. How many of you have heard about growth? Great. Good. So a fixed mindset basically is this idea that I can only do this, I can only do that, I can do no better, right? Or no different. A growth mindset is I can't do that, but it doesn't mean I'll never be able to do that, right? I'm not there, but it doesn't mean I will never be there. That's a growth mindset. You're saying I can change. I don't have to be stuck in where I'm at. And this is really one of the problems when we talk about in schools in the United States, we have a problem with fixed mindset. We have a problem with fixed mindset. They did this study and we're using students in Japan and using students in the United States, right? And so they took first grade students and they gave them an impossible math problem for them to solve, right? First grade students in the United States and in Japan. And so they asked them to work on that problem. How long do you think the first graders in the United States worked on an impossible math problem before they stopped? How long do you think? Think about your little ones. I know they're not doing math right now, but think about how long would they go at a task that they cannot complete? It's not possible. How long would they go at a task before they would give up and say, I'm done?
5 seconds.
5 seconds? Anyone else?
45 seconds.
You guys are very close. It was about a minute before they gave up, right? How long do you think the Japanese students, again, we're talking about first grade, we're not talking about high school. We're talking about first grade. How long did the Japanese first grade students continue to work on an impossible math problem before they gave up?
Didn't give up. They still trying.
Who says they didn't give up? They didn't give up. You're right. The researchers stopped them after 45 minutes. Stopped them and said, it's okay. You guys will not be able to solve this. This is impossible. We gave you, first of all, they're like, why would you even give us an impossible math problem? Right? It can't be. So the question is, what's the difference between US and Japan kids? Are Japanese kids better?
The education.
What's the difference?
The education. The education system.
What would you think about the education that's different? These are first grade students. It's not like they've been in there for a long time, right? It's not like they've been 12, 13 years in this education system. They've only been in there for 2 years.
They subscribe to the constant names trying to get better. Didn't do it, try again. Didn't do it, try again.
Exactly. So and the difference is between a fixed mindset and a growth mindset. That's the difference that they found out. So as they looked into it a little bit more and did a little bit more research into it, so what they saw was like, so if you have a student in the United States, and so if they got a reading award, right? And they look at a parent who responds to that kid and said, oh, you got a reading award. You are so, what do parents say here? Smart. You are so smart. You are doing what smart people do. You are really, you and your friends are smart because you guys got this reading award. When a student in Japan gets an award, what does the parent tell them? Oh, look at the effort you put in has paid off. You put in the work and look what you got from the work that you put in. What's the difference between those two things? On one, the kid is recognizing if I do the work, I can get the reward, right? That's why those first grade students are like, if I just try hard enough, I'm going to get this, right? In the US, it's you're smart. So what happens if I can't do something? I'm not smart. And if I'm not smart, I don't do it, right? I can't do it because either I can or I can't. That's one of the things that we have to be careful about as educators and as parents. Parents should understand this truth. You should never tell your child or your students that they are smart. I know that sounds like, what are you talking about? Right? The reason why, because if you tell someone they're smart, you're setting up a fixed mindset. Because you're telling them you are this smart. So what happens to kids? Because it happens to every kid, they will struggle. And what happens when they struggle? How do they see themselves? You told me I was smart, but I can't do this. So what does that mean? I'm not smart. It's no wonder we have a problem with imposter syndrome, right? Because kids are told, you're smart, you're smart, you're smart, you're so, right? And then all of a sudden they get to that point where they can't do it. Now, when we see in grades that, again, we start talking about intermediate grades and beyond, it does happen sometimes in primary grades. If you look at kids who are probably going to cheat or get around the system, which kids are they? The kids that are failing or the kids who are succeeding? What we would consider the A students. Why? Why are they the ones that are cheating? That makes no sense. Why do you have an A student who will copy someone else's work, who will look over during the test? Why is it those students? They've been told they have a fixed mindset. They were told all along that they're smart, and now they're up against the wall because now they can't do something. Instead of having this like, all right, I can't do it now, but if I try hard enough, I can do it. Or if I put extra effort, I might be able to do it. They're like, either I can or I can't, and I can't. And so either now I admit that I'm not smart, or I cheat. And then now, so people keep this belief that I am smart. Okay. This is a US thing. I don't know about other cultures, you know about Japan, you of the study, right? And this is the other interesting thing about that study. That the researchers went to a fourth grade classroom and they were observing it. Again, it was a math lesson. And the students were working on a problem independently. And so the kids were working, the teacher was walking around. And so the teacher was walking around, looking at what the kids were doing. And the teacher went to and said, oh, go to the board and put your problem, go do your problem up on the board. We've seen this, right? You've seen that. The teacher said, oh, do your problem on the board. So the student went and did their problem on the board, right? And so he finished and the teacher said, okay, class, is that correct? And the class said, no. She said, okay, do it again, right? So the kid did it again. Class, is this correct? No. Do it again, right? So the kid erased it and did it again. So this was 2 more times. And the researcher said they were feeling uncomfortable for this kid, right? Because this was the 4th time that they were doing this problem and they still haven't got it right. And they're standing in front of the whole class, right? And they didn't get it right. So the researcher was feeling uncomfortable for this kid. And so the 5th time that the kid did it, put on the board, and the teacher said, class, is this correct? And they said, yes. And then they all clapped for him, right? And he sat down. And so what the researchers realized is that in that classroom, right? So if you want to talk about the education, in that classroom, right? And in that particular way that the teachers view their students, right? A struggling student is a student who is learning. That's how they view it. A struggling student is a student who is learning. So if you're struggling, there's no shame in that. That's part of the process. Everyone struggles to do something. You never get things right the first time. How do we look at struggling students? I'm talking for you guys from an educator standpoint. How do educators look at struggling students? Maybe not you, but how do you see that other educators in other grades that you see, how do they look at struggling students?
They need help.
They need help, but that they're not capable, right? They don't look at these struggling students as students who will eventually get it, but who can't get it, and so they need the extra help because they can't get it. That's the difference between a fixed mindset and a growth mindset. So we have to be careful, either as educators or as parents, that we don't, right, set our own kids up for a fixed mindset. And I tell that to my daughter now with my 5-year-old granddaughter, and she'll say, even my own wife, who's also an educator, she taught primary grade, and she'll say to her, "Oh, yeah, you're so smart." I said, "Tell her she's smart, right? Tell her what she's good at. This is the difference. Tell her what she's good at. So tell her, Lena, you did such a good job figuring that out, right? Lena, you have such a good memory, right? You were able to remember that. That is great. Lena, you kept on trying until you got that done. That is great." Not like, "Oh, you're so smart, you figured that out." Because again, that sets up that fixed mindset. So we want to be able to have, and you might have heard this. This is the idea. How many of you have heard about the power of yet? You heard that term? So this is what we've tried to help educators use it, and they do use it, but unfortunately they do some other things that go along with it. But the power of yet is to teach kids, I can't do that yet. Right? So really what we should tell, as someone says, a kid says, "I can't do that." You're right. Yeah. I can't do that yet. Right? You can do it. You just can't do it yet. It's okay. I would remind students when I was a teacher and I was a principal, I used to say, when they say, "Oh, I can't do this," I'd say, you can't do this. You can't do it yet. I'd say, remember when you were little, you probably don't remember this. There was a time when you couldn't walk. Right? And then you tried to walk, you got up and you fell down. And then you got up again, you got sick, and you fell down. I said, "But look at you now. Look at what walker you are." Yeah, of course. This is how sometimes we can help kids out, right? By reminding them of where they come. Like telling kids, like, "Yeah, but look, remember when you couldn't do that? And look what you can do now. Remember when you didn't know how to do that? And look what you can do now." We want to remind them that they've been through a process that they're on now. They didn't pop up to where they're at now. They've been through a process, right? It helps them to see. There was another, one more quick story again. There was another a 3rd grade class. They're doing reading, and they would take turns reading. And so one student was reading a passage, and she ended up like didn't know the word. And the teacher was like, "Oh, that is a difficult word." Says, "Does anybody know that word?" One little boy raised his hand, and she said, "Yes, do you know that word?" He said, "Yeah, it's Albuquerque." Have you ever seen the word Albuquerque? I could see why someone would know that. And she's like, "Oh my gosh." Now what's our usual response to that? "Wow, you're so smart. You knew Albuquerque." That teacher did a really good thing, which we should all do when something like that happens. She said, "How did you know that was Albuquerque?" And he said, "We have family in Albuquerque. We go to Albuquerque every summer." And he's seen the word, right? He knows what it is. He didn't sound it out. He just knew what it was because he'd been there so many times. But what that did was for other students, because what happens is when other students are looking at kids and a kid gets something right, they, "Oh my, that kid's so smart," right? But by asking, "How did you know that?" Right? Exposing to the other students, like, this kid got it because of something. Either they read about it, they experienced it, they did something that they got there. And if that person can do it, I can do it too. If that person can read about it, I can read about it too. I can get to where that person is. That's why we try to expose that and not just say, "Oh, you're so smart, you knew what Albuquerque was." How did you know what Albuquerque was? When we talk about advantage, when we talk about in education, when we talk about advantaged students versus disadvantaged students, what usually that is students who have experiences that the other students don't have, right? That's why they're advantaged in education, because they have experiences and the other kids don't. At the school that I was a principal at was in a very poor socioeconomic area. And so one day a teacher was doing a lesson on the ocean. And she told the kids, the lesson was, it's a story about a kid in the ocean. And she's like, oh, something about the kid putting his toes in the sand. She goes, oh, you know what that feels like when you put your toes in the sand and you can feel the sand in between your toes? And they were like, no. She goes, yeah, I do know what that's like. They go, no. I go, teacher, we've never been to the beach. They could not access that because of the fact that they had never had that experience. So, but going back to this idea of biases, we could end up being like, well, these kids aren't bright because they can't answer that thing. We always have to be willing to dig a little bit deeper to find out, to be open to someone else's experience. So when we start talking about how to start, this whole thing is about perspective, so I'm not going to get through this. These are some things that we can do to kind of keep that good, right? And people feeling like they belong, right? Things that we can do. One is we should talk about differences. This is what leads to one of the problems when it comes to bullying. So if a kid goes into a classroom, you might have this happen to some of your kids, and they go, oh, teacher, why is that chair red? The other ones are blue. What do you say? Oh, probably because they couldn't have enough blue chairs, so they brought in a red one. But what happens when that same kid goes, why is that person in a wheelchair? Or why does that person's arm, different? Why does that person's face look like that? What do we say? Oh, don't talk about that, right? Oh no, we don't talk about it. We don't just kind of keep that quiet. Well, why is that a problem? What are we teaching the kids? We're teaching them, remember, here's your brain figuring out what's good and what's bad. And we say, shh, don't talk about that. What does their brain tell them? That's bad. Right? What does the brain tell them? If people are different, it's bad. Because I can't talk about it. If the chairs are different, that's okay. I can talk about that. But I can't talk about people being different. Right? And you know this, you guys that work with little kids. Why is that person's skin so dark? What would you say? Shh. Don't talk about that. And parents would do that, right? And so what do they teach that kid? Differences are bad when it comes to people. And if they're bad, I need to push them away. They're not part of my tribe, right? They're bad. I can't talk about that. So we're creating that problem. We need to talk about differences. We need to be able to say, ideally, and I understand we're in a society that kind of is different than that, but say, ideally, it'd be great to say, yeah, that person in a wheelchair, probably because they have maybe they were in an accident, maybe they had whatever it is, right? It'd be great to be, and if people were open to it, it'd be great to be able to say, do you mind if we ask you about what happened? Right? So we can learn, right? That would be great. And again, encouraging questions so that we get beyond. So do you think everyone is like that? Because someone say, well, I know those people, they're always like, are you sure they're always like that? Or is it that one person you were talking to? Right? Do you think people are always like that? You think sometimes people might think about you in a certain way because of the way you look, the way you have your hair? And are you always like that? You kind of try to help it out. And then using really simple terms, like, for the helping kids understand about, it's not right to be mean to them. Just because they're different doesn't mean that you should treat them, in a way that is not right, in a way that's mean. This is the interesting thing. When it comes to kids, the biggest difference that happens with bullying in schools, right, is the bystander. When other kids won't put up with it, it stops. When other kids are compliant with it, it continues. Now, how do you get kids to stand up, right, for people that are being treated bad? And one study that they did, they asked kids, right, like what would make a difference for them on whether or not they're willing to stand up for their friend who someone's saying something mean about, and whether or not they wouldn't. And you know what the ones that are willing to stand up for their friends, you know why they said they're willing to do it? Because my teacher expects us to treat each other that way, in a nice way. Isn't that interesting? Because our teacher expects us to treat each other in a nice way. If we talk to kids about how we should be treating other people, it does make a difference, right? It does make a difference for us. And then, of course, modeling is a big thing, right? When we encourage that and we bring people in, when we use that inclusive language, right? And this is a big thing for kids, addressing our mistakes, right? We have to be willing as adults to tell kids we make mistakes. I did that wrong, right? You're right. I shouldn't have done that. Or I shouldn't have said that. Or I shouldn't have gotten angry. There are things we don't say to kids. So what we're telling them is it's okay to be like that. It doesn't matter what we say, how we model is really going to make a big difference for kids, right? Yeah. And here, this is why it's so important, right? It's not about what we teach kids to see, but we teach them how to see it. It's not about you should see this, but how should we look at people? Meaning, we should look at people with a goodness, right? Recognizing there's a, I don't know if you're familiar, any of you familiar with Homeboy Industries out in Los Angeles?
Yes.
Yeah, Homeboy Industries was started by a priest, Father Greg Boyle. And it is the largest gang intervention and rehabilitation center in the world, right? They work with gang members, and they have done a tremendous job at helping people to change that lifestyle. How do they do it? He lives by two things. There are two things that if you ask him, he'll tell you. One is he believes in the unshakable goodness of everybody, no exceptions. And two, we belong to each other, no exceptions. And interesting, huh? And they asked him, like, some of these people are evil, these gang members, right? They sell drugs, they've taken drugs, they've killed, right? They've assaulted, they've done all these things. He said, I've never met an evil person. He said, I've met unhealthy people. I've never met an evil person. Because I've seen horrible things, but I've never met an evil person. He said, so they treat these gang members from their goodness. And they start there. Let me start with the fact that everybody is good. So that's how he sees the world. And that's why he works with these people. How do we teach our kids how to see the world and the people that are in front of them? How do we do that? Right? And so for ourselves, this is the way that we challenge our own biases, right? First, we have to acknowledge that we have biases. That's the first thing. And we have to acknowledge that we're working from unconscious biases a lot of the time. And we have to be aware of that. And then we have to start, the idea about practice mindful reactions is really starting to think about how you feel about certain things. Like when you come across me, you feel like a little strange. Like let's say, you're walking past the person, wherever it is, and you feel a little uncomfortable about that person. Then think yourself, why do I feel uncomfortable with that person? Is there something that makes me feel that way? Right? Is there something that's acting? Do I have some preconceived understanding about that type of person that I'm not even aware of that makes me feel uncomfortable about? It's just like if I were to tell you right now, picture a doctor. If you ask that for people, what gender do you think most people will choose in their mind? A male, right? And if I were to say surgeon, a specialist, right? You'll picture a male. That's an unconscious bias. That's just that naturally comes up, right? If I said to you, and this is one of the reasons why we have such a problem in the United States. If I say, think about a family on welfare that gets food stamps. Do you picture a certain ethnicity or a certain race? If that's true, why? Why does that happen? Those are things that come to you right away, right? Those are your unconscious biases that come up. And whenever you hear that, it gets triggered. So we have to educate ourselves and be open to that. And the big thing we want to do is practice empathy. And empathy is trying to understand who that person is and saying, I understand your situation or want to understand your situation, right? And so when you're open to that, that really what makes a difference for us with our biases. I want to mention three things that can help us out, right? One is there's a guy, Dan Siegel, I don't know if you're familiar with. He wrote the yes frame. I want to talk about helping students out with the growth mindset. You can read that, the yes frame, and he talks about ways to help students to kind of move past and help them to kind of grow, right? That's a good book to look at. Since I have a 5-year-old, she likes to like gluing. And there was a particular episode called The Sign and the Farmer. And it's a story about, and you might have heard this parable, it's a Chinese parable about a farmer who things happen to the farmer and everyone's like, oh, that's so terrible that happens. And he's like, we'll see, right? And then something else good happens because of that, right? And then they go, oh, that's so great that happened. And he goes, we'll see. And then something bad happens. And they go, oh, that's so bad. He goes, we'll see. So it really is a story about like, hey, don't be so quick to judge. You think something, whether it's good or bad, we don't know, right? We'll see whether or not it's good or bad. Time might tell. And then the other one, for your own personal thing, this is Father Greg Boyle's Tattoos on the Heart. Has anybody read Tattoos on the Heart? Now, he is a priest, so he does talk about God. And so if you're not a person who is religious, he does talk about God. But when you read these stories about gang members and about how he looks at it, and this is called the power of boundless compassion, and he talks about how not having a certain compassion, right, where no one is standing outside. And it really is helping us to cut biases. Because especially when it comes to gang members, right, we have a certain thing about who these people are. And then you'll read stories about these gang members, and you start to recognize that as he looks at it, these people are hurt. They're not bad people, they're hurt people, right? And again, he doesn't excuse behavior in that, oh, it's okay what they did, but he also doesn't dispose of people because of what they did, right? Because disposing of people would be stereotyping them, right? And saying, these people are not good enough to be here. They're not good enough to be a part of this. You say, no, everyone is good. They may not be ready to be a part of this, but it doesn't mean that they're not good. It doesn't mean they can't be a part of it. So those are our three things. I think this, if we want for our own personal understanding how to work with kids, the yes frames are a really good one. We want to understand our own biases and how to think about our own biases. Tattoos on the Heart is really good. And then we can start thinking about some resources to kind of help us out. The top one really is a list of books for early childhood that would help out with anti-bias. They're just stories that help kids look at differences and look at how people deal. So that's a good one to go to and just take a look at the list of books. In fact, I think this one is, and then the third one, the second one is Dan Siegel. You can go to his site. There are resources in there. He talks about, the other thing that he talks about is integration and helping kids to his whole focus is early childhood and adults. He doesn't work with adults. Early childhood, one of the things he really talks about integration and this idea about helping people see self as not just being this, but as self being this, right? So he said we need to help kids understand that when we talk about self, that self is here, that self is there. And so that's when we start to curb some of these things about bias, some of these things about prejudice, right? That we start to recognize. And he always says, we cut this through kindness. And how do we get through kindness is through integration. So he's a good person to go take a look at if you want some personal background in your own study on that. And then the third link is for books on growth mindset. I think this one has 15 books on growth mindset, right, that you can read to kids to help them get past this idea that I can't do it, right? But I can do it. even if we're good at sick. And then that last one is where you can go take a test to check your own implicit biases, right? So that was put out by Harvard University. You can take it and they'll give you a list of things like, I want to check my political implicit bias. I want to check mine on disability, on race, on religion. There's a bunch of things. You can take them all if you want to. But it's very interesting to come out and say, oh, I didn't even know that I kind of had a bias toward that. So it's set up so that you are reacting to things and not thinking about them, because that's how we find those biases. We see, what do we react to, not what do we think about? Not we're trying to think about what's the right answer, but what is it that comes to us right away. All right. So this was really quick, right? I know we touched on just barely this topic. There's a lot of things that we could talk more about. Any questions or comments that you guys have?